There are two small objects in two museums, and between them they hold the oldest argument in human history. The first is a piece of clay. It would sit in your palm, flat, grey-brown, roughly the size of a bar of soap, its surface covered in shallow marks pressed into it with a cut reed while it was still soft. The marks are not random, they form a pattern, wedge shapes and pictographs arranged in careful columns, the way a deliberate mind arranges things when it wants to be understood across time. The clay was found in the ruins of a city called Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, in the district that once held the temple of the sky goddess. It is, on the best current dating, roughly 5,300 years old. The second object is smaller, a bone tag, 2 centimeters by 1.5, barely larger than a postage stamp, with a tiny hole drilled in one corner so it could be tied to something. A label, attached to the outside of a jar or a box, identifying what was inside. It carries a handful of scratched signs on its surface, not random either, but arranged, deliberate, pointing toward a meaning. It came out of a plundered tomb in the desert at Abydos in southern Egypt, and it is, on the best current dating, roughly 5,300 years old too. Remember that. Both of them are the size of a stamp. Everything tonight comes back to that. Because these two objects are the earliest writing anyone has ever found. One from Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, in what is now Iraq. One from Egypt, and for most of the last century, the question of which civilization invented writing first was considered settled, even a little boring in its settledness. Mesopotamia, comfortably. Egypt's writing was thought to appear centuries later, which fit a tidy and satisfying story. Writing was invented once, in Sumer, in the south of what is now Iraq, and the idea spread outward like ripples on a still surface. Mesopotamia was the stone, Egypt was the ripple. And then, in 1998, a German excavation team published what they had found in a robbed and scattered tomb at Abydos, and the gap closed. Not to zero, to something more uncomfortable than zero. The dates overlap. The earliest Egyptian tags and the earliest Mesopotamian tablets now sit inside the same century-and-a-half window. The margin between them, the gap that was supposed to represent the time it took for the idea of writing to travel 1,500 kilometers from Sumer to Egypt, is now smaller than the error bars on the dating methods themselves, which means that the honest answer to the question of which civilization invented writing first is no longer Mesopotamia. It is, we cannot currently tell, and it may be closer than a single human lifetime. Two peoples, 1,500 kilometers apart, with a desert and a sea between them, sat down at almost exactly the same moment in history and started making marks that meant things. Signature sentence. So tonight we are going to settle this, or we are going to find out exactly why it cannot be settled, and why that, in the end, is the more interesting answer. Which of these civilizations built the first city? Which one had a country before the other had a king? What is actually written on the oldest tablet ever found? Because it is not a prayer, and it is not a poem, and when I tell you what it is, it will make you reconsider what writing is actually for. Is there evidence these two civilizations knew about each other? There is one object, a carved knife handle that has been sitting in the Louvre for over a century, that suggests the answer to that question is considerably more complicated than anyone expected. And is there a third answer to tonight's question? An answer that is older than both Sumer and Egypt by 6,000 years, built by people who had no cities and no writing and no metal and no agriculture, and who built something that none of us have since matched for mystery. Before we begin, close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to keep score tonight. This is a long, slow walk down two rivers, and you can drift off on either bank. That is exactly right. You do not need to follow every word. Some nights the voice is simply the sound, and the images come and go behind your eyes like something half remembered from another life. That is perfect too. The history will still be there when you surface. The clay tablets and the bone tags will wait for you. They have waited 5,000 years already. Some of you will fall asleep before we reach the knife handle in the Louvre. Some of you will still be awake when we arrive at the buried circles on the limestone ridge in Turkey, 11,000 years before writing. Both of those nights are complete. There is no right distance to travel tonight. What you reach is yours. What you carry into sleep is what matters, not what you missed. The rivers are long and they are patient, and you are welcome to rest at any moment on either bank. This is for the ones who like a question that turns out to be harder than it looked. For the ones who, when they were younger, looked at photographs of pyramids or stumbled on a documentary about ancient civilizations and felt something that was difficult to name, a pull, a kind of recognition, a sense that these places and these people mattered in a way the standard accounts were not quite capturing. For the quiet ones who notice the detail that doesn't fit. If that sounds like you, you are exactly where you should be tonight. I am curious about you. Where in the world are you right now, listening to this? What hour is it where you are? Someone is in London with rain tracking down the glass. Someone in Canada at the edge of autumn. Someone in the southern hemisphere where the winter is already softening. Someone in a different time zone entirely, where tonight doesn't exist yet. Leave your city and your hour in the comments below. I read them in the mornings, and I like to think of the map of places this voice is traveling while I sleep. If this kind of quiet history suits your nights, a gentle like lets the algorithm know and sends this to someone else who might need it. No urgency. We have all the time in the world tonight. Let's start at the actual beginning, not with the question of who came first, but with what was there at all. The land, the water, the specific texture of two very different worlds, each producing a very different kind of civilization. In what we now call Iraq, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates is a vast flat alluvial plain of extraordinary fertility and extraordinary unpredictability. The two rivers run roughly parallel, both heading south toward the Persian Gulf, and both carrying enormous loads of rich silt washed down from the mountains of Anatolia and Iran. Every spring they flood, sometimes gently, a broad, brown, gradual expansion of the water table, creeping across the flat landscape, bringing the silt and the moisture that the fields need. Sometimes catastrophically, a violent surge that sweeps away embankments and irrigation channels and everything built near the water's edge, leaving the survivors to start again in the mud. When the floods recede, they leave behind a deposit of dark, fine-grained alluvial silt that will grow almost anything if you water it correctly. But the timing and the scale of the floods cannot be predicted from year to year with any reliability. They are driven by rainfall patterns in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, hundreds of miles away and invisible from the plain. The Mesopotamian farmer works in a landscape of extraordinary generosity and genuine danger, never entirely certain that this year's flood will not be the one that destroys what took 3 years to build. This is the landscape the ancient Greeks called Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. And the people who built their lives here had almost nothing to work with except what the rivers gave them: silt, water, and reeds. There is no stone in the alluvial plain of southern Iraq, no timber, no metal, no hard mineral resources of any kind. Everything had to be traded for or improvised from local materials. From silt, water, and reeds, they built a civilization. The reeds they wove into shelters and boats and baskets and matting. The silt they shaped into bricks, not fired, not kiln-hardened, just shaped and dried in the sun, which meant the bricks dissolved back into mud when they got wet, and every building was in a constant cycle of erosion and repair, collapse and reconstruction. The water they channeled through networks of irrigation canals that ran for miles across the flat landscape, maintained by the coordinated labor of everyone whose fields they served. And the canal networks are the engine of everything, because the moment you build a canal system of any real size, you create problems that don't have simple answers. Who gets water first in a dry year? Whose obligation is it to repair the section of embankment that is failing? Who decides when to open the sluice gate, and on what authority? What happens to the family downstream when the family upstream takes more than their share? These questions do not have obvious answers embedded in nature. They require agreement. They require enforcement. They require someone to remember, from year to year and from season to season, what was decided and what precedent was set, and what each household owes in labor and what they are entitled to in water. At a small scale, a village of a few dozen families, working a canal system of a few miles, all of this can live in the community's collective memory. The elders remember, the seasonal rituals encode the knowledge, the oral traditions carry the precedence. But at a certain scale, when the settlement becomes a town, then a city, when the canal network extends for many miles in all directions, when the temple complex employs hundreds or thousands of workers and manages the distribution of grain to thousands more, the human memory fails. It cannot hold enough. It makes mistakes. It dies with the person who had it. You need something outside the head. You need marks on surfaces. Before we get to the marks, though, let me ask you to hold one number in your mind. A single year, 1998. W2, planted, 12 min. It will return to us about halfway through tonight, and when it does, it will close a gap that was open for most of the 20th century. Now, the other river. The Nile is a completely different proposition, and in many ways the differences between the two rivers explain the differences between the two civilizations more clearly than any other single factor. The Nile floods too, but the Nile floods on a schedule, a calendrical regularity that the Egyptians observed for thousands of years and built their entire civilization around. The Nile begins to rise in June, fed by the summer monsoon rains falling on the Ethiopian plateau, 4,000 kilometers to the south. The water arrives at Aswan in July, reaches the delta in September, and by late October has retreated, leaving the valley floor covered in a layer of dark, extraordinarily rich silt, the Kemet, the Black Land, as the Egyptians called it. Then the desert reasserts itself on either side, the Deshret, the Red Land, until the flood comes again, and comes again, and comes again. Every year, on the same schedule, reliably, for as long as anyone has lived in the valley. This predictability changes everything about how you plan. In Mesopotamia, a farmer who has had 3 good years of manageable floods cannot assume that the 4th year will be the same. In Egypt, a farmer who has had 3 good floods can assume, with reasonable confidence, that the 4th flood will arrive in the same season, last for roughly the same duration, and deposit roughly the same amount of silt. The Egyptian agricultural year is not an adaptation to uncertainty. It is a clock. A civilization built on a reliable annual clock is a civilization that can commit resources years in advance, that can plan monumental projects across decades, that can trust in the future in a way that the Mesopotamian plain does not permit. When you know what next year will look like, broadly, in its essential outlines, you can build for next year in ways that are impossible when you're not sure whether next year will bring a gentle flood or a catastrophic one. And the shape of Egypt, this too is important. The Nile's cultivable land is narrow. On either bank, the Black Land extends perhaps a mile or 2 before the desert cliff begins. Egypt is not a plain. It is a corridor, 800 miles long, a few miles wide, with nothing on either side but rock and sand and the bones of ancient caravans. And a corridor has a completely different political logic than a plain. In Mesopotamia, the plain means that settlements can grow in any direction. They can cluster and compete and form city-states that bump against each other, independent urban centers, each with its own king and its own gods and its own economy, negotiating and fighting and alliancing and breaking alliances for centuries without any single one establishing permanent dominance. Uruk and and Eridu and Nippur and Lagash and Kish were not provinces of a country. They were sovereign entities, sharing a language and a religious tradition and a writing system, but not a ruler. They were to each other what Athens was to Sparta, or what Florence was to Venice, culturally related, politically separate, frequently at war. In Egypt, the corridor dictates a different logic entirely. Control the river, control the water and the grain storage and the boat traffic, and you control everything. The geography almost demands unification. A single ruler controlling the main artery of the corridor controls all the agricultural surplus that flows through it. A single administration managing the distribution of that surplus can, in principle, feed and organize an entire elongated country of millions of people with a level of efficiency that the fragmented city-states of Mesopotamia could not match. Egypt's geography pushed, insistently and over centuries, toward the creation of one large state. These two geographies produced two different political structures. Those political structures produced two different relationships to administration, two different relationships to writing, two different societies. And those differences, as we'll see tonight, show up clearly in the comparison. The differences are visible right down to the texture of the written record each system produced. In Mesopotamia, the administrative tablets from the Uruk period are inherently plural, thousands of tablets across hundreds of years, each one a small transaction, a delivery, a ration, a count of livestock, recorded by someone whose name is rarely on the tablet itself, filed in the institutional archive of a particular temple or palace, replacing yesterday's entry when this season's figures came in. The Mesopotamian written record is granular, cumulative, and distributed. The record of a complex economy run by many scribes in many offices across many competing city-states, none of them managing more than their portion of the whole. No single hand is responsible for the whole. No single mind holds the system. It is collective knowledge distributed across the archive. The Egyptian record is different in character. Egypt's pharaoh was not a king in the Mesopotamian sense, not a military strongman who had won power over competitors and needed to administer it carefully to keep it. The pharaoh was, in the Egyptian conception, a god walking on earth, the living Horus, the son of Ra, the guarantor of Ma'at, the divinely ordered balance of the universe, whose personal vitality was what held back the chaos that threatened to return the world to the formless state it had existed in before creation. This is not a metaphor that the Egyptians kept at arm's length. It was the functional basis of the state. The pharaoh's ability to control the Nile flood, symbolically, ritually, through the performance of the correct rites at the correct moments in the agricultural calendar, was the expressed basis of his authority. When the pharaoh performed the opening of the dikes at the correct time, the flood came. When the pharaoh offered the correct sacrifices, the harvest was good. The Egyptian state was, in its self-understanding, a cosmic system, not merely a political one. This conception of the ruler's role produces a specific kind of administrative record, where Mesopotamian tablets are predominantly about quantities, how many, how much, when. Egyptian administrative texts, as they develop through the Old and Middle Kingdoms, are also about status, obligation, and sacred hierarchy, the elaborate protocols governing who could approach the pharaoh and in what posture and with what form of address. The careful registration of who held which priestly office and which administrative district. Administration in Egypt was theology in a way that the Mesopotamian city-state, with its multiple competing gods and its commercially minded temple economies, never quite achieved. Which is not to say the Egyptian system was ineffective. The opposite. The vizier, the highest administrative official below the pharaoh, managing the entire civil apparatus of the state, was one of the most powerful non-royal figures in the ancient world, and one of the most precisely described. The duties of the vizier are laid out in tomb inscriptions of the New Kingdom period, with a specificity that reads like a job description from a modern civil service handbook. He receives reports from district governors every morning. He sends orders daily to garrison commanders. He controls the sealing of royal warehouses. He hears cases and issues judgments. He controls access to the pharaoh's audience chamber. The document containing this description, inscribed in the tombs of two different New Kingdom viziers, is, in some sense, the world's oldest job description for a head of civil service. The scribes who made all of this work, who recorded the tax returns and the land surveys and the court records and the medical prescriptions and the military dispatches, were trained in institutions called houses of life, associated with major temple complexes. The training was long, the standards were high, and the position of scribe conferred a social status that Egyptian texts record with undisguised satisfaction. One famous scribal composition, the Satire of the Trades, surviving in multiple copies and clearly used as a teaching text, describes in deliberately comic terms the miseries of every other occupation. The soldier is hot and tired. The potter is covered in clay. The barber's hands are sore from shaving. The fisherman is cold and wet. Only the scribe sits in his office, cool and clean and respected, directing others while others struggle. Be a scribe, the text concludes. It is better than any profession. This text was composed somewhere around 2000 BC, and it reads as freshly as a satirical essay written this year. The scribe's tool was the reed pen and black ink on papyrus or on limestone flakes and pottery shards when papyrus was too expensive for practice. The writing surface was the flat plane, no wedge shapes, no impressing, but a drawn or painted form, the pictographic origins of the hieroglyphs always legible in the signs, even when they were written quickly in the cursive script called hieratic. A hieroglyphic sign that represented a seated man holding a scroll meant scribe. A sign that represented a pair of sandals meant the sandal maker's occupation. The system was visual in a way that proto-cuneiform was rapidly ceasing to be. The Mesopotamian signs, pressed into clay with a cut reed, had by 3000 BC already abstracted away from their pictographic origins to the point where the original images were difficult to recover. Egyptian hieroglyphics remained, for 3000 years, recognizably pictures. But now, what were those administrators in Uruk's temple district actually writing down? A shift to evidence. Here is the fact that most introductory accounts of writing's invention skip past because it sounds too mundane. The proto-cuneiform tablets from the Eanna district at Uruk, the 5,000 tablets excavated by the German Archaeological Institute over decades of work, are, in approximately 88% of cases, accounting records. One premium frame, grain received from a particular field, sheep counted and tallied, beer rations distributed to workers, and a labourer in Uruk around 3200 BC received approximately 4 to 5 litres of barley beer per day as part of their standard compensation, a fact that explains quite a lot about the spirit of early Sumerian poetry, if you've ever read any. Labour hours for canal maintenance, textile output from the weaving workshops, commodity deliveries to the warehouse, the quantity of oil pressed, of fish dried, of dates sorted. The remaining approximately 12% of those earliest tablets are thematic word lists, scribal training exercises, essentially, in which apprentice administrators learn the signs by copying out organized inventories of commodities and animals and occupational titles, the way a student today might learn vocabulary by copying it out in columns. And here is what I want you to hold. The world's first writing was not a prayer, it was not a poem, it was not a law, not a philosophical argument, not a love letter, not a myth. The world's first writing was a receipt, an inventory, a spreadsheet. The moment that separates prehistory from history, the threshold that all of human civilization crossed exactly once, was not crossed by a philosopher or a poet or a priest. It was crossed by an accountant. Someone in the administrative offices of the Eanna temple complex in Uruk, whose shelves were too full and whose memory was insufficient, picked up a cut reed and pressed it into a piece of wet clay and made a mark that meant a specific number of a specific commodity, and in doing so created writing. I find this both slightly funny and genuinely illuminating. Funny because the grandest origin story in human intellectual history, the invention of the ability to record thought, turns out to be motivated by a logistics problem. Illuminating because it tells you exactly what writing is. A tool for extending human memory. Not an art form and not a ceremony, though both of those came later. A prosthetic for the mind. A way of remembering things that there are too many of to carry in your head. And it was a tool that, apparently, two different human societies invented, in two different materials, with two different sets of signs, on two different river systems, within the same century and a half of each other. Before we get to the anomaly that established this parallel invention, and it is a remarkable anomaly, and the excavation behind it is one of the best stories in recent Near Eastern archaeology, let me give you one more thing to hold. W5 planted W2 minin. The conventional dates for the Mesopotamian tablets, the dates that put Uruk ahead of Egypt on writing, that established the Mesopotamia first consensus for the 20th century, rest substantially on the stratigraphy of a single deep sounding at the Uruk site itself. One carefully excavated column through the debris layers of one part of the city, correlated with pottery sequences and radiocarbon dates. Meticulous work, performed by skilled archaeologists over many seasons, but one hole in the ground. When we come to score the race at the end of tonight, when we look at the full picture and try to give an honest answer, that foundation will matter, because the margin between the Mesopotamian tablets and the Egyptian tags is smaller than most people realize, and smaller than the uncertainty in the methods we use to date them. For now, though, let's go to Egypt. The necropolis at Abydos is called el-Ka'ab. The name means Mother of Pots, because the surface of the site, when archaeologists first began to map it seriously in the late 19th century, was covered in a dense layer of broken pottery, the accumulated debris of 3,000 years of pilgrimage and offering. Pilgrims had been coming here since the Middle Kingdom, perhaps earlier, leaving offerings at what they understood to be the burial place of Osiris, the god of the dead, whose mythological tomb tradition placed in this stretch of the upper Egyptian desert. Under that meter of broken offerings, under the pilgrim deposits of 100 generations, were the actual tombs, the burial places of Egypt's pre-dynastic kings, the rulers who preceded the first dynasty, who are known collectively as Dynasty Zero, or the pre-dynastic pharaohs. These tombs had been plundered, comprehensively and repeatedly. In antiquity, possibly even in the early dynastic period, when the political structures that might have protected them were still forming. In the medieval period. In the 19th century, when the antiques market made systematic looting economically attractive. By the time Flinders Petrie conducted his careful excavations in the early 1900s, most of the tombs were empty. Not just emptied, but scoured, the structural timbers removed, the portable objects carried away, In several cases, even the bones of the burial scattered or taken. Günter Dreyer, director of the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo, began working at el-Ka'ab in the 1970s. His team's work was systematic and exacting, the kind of excavation that attends to the fragment rather than the object, that records the position of every shard and reconstructs the original assemblage from what the robbers didn't bother to take. Several of the tombs were large enough to suggest royal burials of the highest order. Among them was one designated Tomb Uj, a large multi-chamber complex with unusual architectural features that suggested its occupant had been among the most powerful individuals in pre-dynastic Egypt. The tomb had been plundered. The chambers were scattered with debris. But Dreyer's team excavated every centimetre of it, recovering fragments and mapping their positions, and from those fragments began to piece together what had originally been there. The scale of what they reconstructed was extraordinary. Approximately 2,000 ceramic vessels had once been distributed across the 12 chambers. The number alone would have been remarkable for this period. But what was more revealing, when Dreyer's team began to identify the origins of those vessels, was how many of them were not Egyptian at all. Approximately a third of the 2,000 jars, perhaps 700 vessels, were imports. Premium framing. Large, distinctive jars of the type used across the Levantine wine trade, the coastal region we now call Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, transported by sea or overland caravan to Egypt, and then up the Nile to Abydos. These jars had carried wine, hundreds of litres of Levantine wine for the burial of a pre-dynastic Egyptian king, and alongside the wine jars, obsidian bowls. Obsidian, volcanic glass, hard and black and impossibly sharp, that could only have originated from sources in Anatolia or in Ethiopia, both hundreds of miles away. Cedar wood from the Lebanese forests, probably in the form of furniture or chests, now mostly reduced to fragments. Linen, ivory objects, including small carved figures. The catalogue of exotic materials in Tomb Uj is not the catalogue of an isolated riverside chieftain. It is the catalogue of someone connected to long-distance trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers, someone who could command, or purchase, or receive as diplomatic tribute goods from as far away as the Anatolian plateau and the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. Scholars have proposed, based on inscriptions found elsewhere at Abydos, that the occupant of Tomb Uj may have been a pre-dynastic ruler, sometimes designated as Scorpion I, not the more famous Scorpion commemorated on the Scorpion macehead a century or so later, but an earlier ruler of the same name or title. This identification remains debated, but the scale of the burial, the quantity of the offerings, and the geographic reach of the imports suggest someone at or near the apex of what was, in this period, the political hierarchy of Upper Egypt. But none of that, not the wine jars, not the obsidian, not the cedar, was what changed the timeline. What changed the timeline was what Dreyer's team found scattered across the floor of the tomb's chambers among the broken pottery and the fragments of boxes. More than 150 small objects made of bone and ivory, some made of clay, each one approximately 2 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters, roughly the size of a postage stamp, each with a small hole drilled in one corner, positioned so that a string could pass through it and tie the object to something. Labels, in other words, the ancient equivalent of a luggage tag or a price tag, attached to jars and boxes and bundles to identify their contents, their origin, their quantity, and each one carrying marks. The marks were not decorative, they were not random, they were hieroglyphs, or proto-hieroglyphs, at the very earliest edge of what we recognize as hieroglyphic writing, arranged in small groups of 1 to 4 signs per tag. The scholars who have studied them most carefully conclude that most of them record places of origin, the nome, the administrative region of Egypt from which a particular delivery of goods had come. Administrative records attached to the merchandise in the burial of a pre-dynastic Egyptian king. Labels on the jars that came from the Levant. Labels on the boxes that held the obsidian. Labels on the linens and the ivories and the cedar. Records. In writing. In Egypt. In a tomb. Dated. By radiocarbon and by ceramic sequence and by cross-correlation with comparable sites. To approximately 3320 to 330. Before the drier publication, the standard account was confident. The earliest clear Egyptian writing was dated to Dynasty 0, around 3200 to 3100 BC, and was consistently described, in the technical literature and in popular accounts, as appearing a few centuries later than in southern Mesopotamia. The gap was treated as meaningful. The gap was the basis for the diffusion theory that had been the consensus for most of the 20th century. Writing arose in Sumer, possibly as early as 3500 BC in some form, and the concept spread to Egypt, where the Egyptians developed their own system in response. A time gap of a few centuries is exactly what you'd expect if the idea were traveling by trade route. Dreyer's publication closed that gap. The bone and ivory tags of Abydos, dated to 3320-3150 BC, overlap substantially with the proto-cuneiform tablets of Uruk, conventionally dated to the Uruk 4 and 3 phases, approximately 3350 to 3200 BC. The margin between the earliest Egyptian writing and the earliest Mesopotamian writing is now, at best, on current evidence, somewhere between 50 and 150 years. And given the inherent uncertainties in radiocarbon dating for this period of the calibration curve, the margin may be smaller than that, may in fact be unmeasurable. And here is the detail that specialists found most arresting. 3. Premium framing. The Egyptian bone tags and the contemporary clay tags from Uruk, both used as labels, both thumbnail-sized, both carrying a small number of signs, in an administrative shorthand that is not yet fully readable as a spoken language, are described in the technical literature as virtually similar, not similar in the sense of sharing signs or systems, but similar in the sense of the idea, a small object, with a hole for attaching it, carrying marks that identify what it's attached to, same concept, same scale, same function, in two different materials, in two different writing systems with no shared signs, 1,500 kilometers apart, in the same century and a half. Sit with that for a moment if you're still awake. Two people, one in the administrative buildings of the Eanna temple complex in Uruk, working in rooms that smelled of grain and wet clay, pressing a cut reed into a small tablet by lamplight, and one in a royal workshop somewhere in Upper Egypt, Hierakonpolis perhaps, or Abydos itself, carving tiny marks into a piece of bone with a flint blade, making a label for a jar of wine that had come from the Lebanese coast. Both of them, or the communities and traditions they represented, decided at roughly the same moment that a mark on a surface could stand for something in the world, could hold information, could be attached to an object and survive the object's journey, and tell the person at the destination what was inside. Both of them, in making that decision, crossed a line that human beings had never crossed before. And on the other side of that line, 5,000 years later, is everything you have ever read. What makes this moment extraordinary, truly extraordinary, in a way that gets lost in the technical debates about dates and stratigraphy, is what it implies about the human mind. The act of writing, at its origin, requires an abstraction that we now perform so automatically we cannot see it, the understanding that a mark on a surface can stand for something else, that this notch, this pressed wedge, this scratched angle of bone, it is not the thing, it is not the jar of wine, it is not the field of barley, it is not the labourer who showed up and received his beer ration, but it points to that thing. It carries information about that thing. And a different person, who was not there when the mark was made, can look at the mark and know something about the thing. This is not a simple cognitive operation. It requires the ability to hold two things in mind simultaneously: the mark and its referent, the sign and its meaning, the symbol and the reality. Philosophers of language have spent centuries trying to describe this relationship precisely. What the scribes of Uruk and Abydos did, working in wet clay and carved bone 5,300 years ago, was not a philosophical operation. It was a practical one. But the practical operation rested on a cognitive capacity, the capacity for arbitrary symbolic representation. That is one of the most distinctive features of the human mind. We cannot reconstruct the experience of the person who first made that operation successfully. We cannot know whether it felt like an invention or like a discovery, whether there was a moment of recognition, a deliberate choice to try something new, or whether it emerged gradually, over generations, each scribe extending the conventions of the previous ones without anyone deciding to create writing as such. The archaeological evidence shows us only the output, the tablets, the tags. It cannot show us the minds that produced them. What it does show us is that at least two different societies, independently or in indirect contact, reached the same cognitive threshold at the same moment in history and crossed it. That this threshold, wherever you locate it precisely in terms of the abstraction involved, was crossable by multiple human communities at once. That the invention or discovery or emergence, however you describe it, of the capacity to make marks that hold information across time and space was not a single lightning strike event of unique genius, but a broadly distributed human potential, waiting for the conditions that would draw it out. Those conditions, both in the Uruk temple district and in the royal workshops of pre-dynastic Abydos, were the same: too much complexity for informal memory to hold, too many transactions, too many relationships, too many seasonal cycles to track, too many goods moving across too much space for any individual mind to manage without assistance. The conditions created the need generated the solution, in two different materials, in two different sign systems, 5,000 kilometers apart, arrived at almost exactly the same moment. Now, before we move to the three possible explanations for this double beginning, I want to plant something in your memory. W3. Planted, 30 min. There is an object in the Louvre, room 636, the ancient Near East section, that I want you to hold in the back of your mind. It is a knife handle, carved from hippopotamus ivory. It comes from the same cultural horizon as Tomb Uj, the same period, the same geographical region. And what is carved on one of its faces should not be there, not in Egypt, not in this period, not without an explanation that implicates the contact between these two civilizations, in a way that is more direct and more physical than trade routes alone can account for. We will come back to the knife handle. When we do, you'll see why Egyptologists have been arguing about it for more than a century. The bridge to what comes next. Two peoples, 1,500 kilometers apart, appear to have invented writing at almost the same moment. Three explanations are possible. Each one implies something different about what human creativity is, and about how civilization spreads. The three possibilities were articulated clearly in the scholarly literature in the years following Dreyer's 1998 publication. Let me walk through each of them carefully, because each one carries a different weight of evidence behind it, and each one implies something genuinely different about the nature of human creativity and civilizational development. The first possibility is independent invention. Under this hypothesis, two separate societies, with no meaningful knowledge of each other, hit the same wall at roughly the same moment, the wall of administrative complexity that exceeds human memory, and both solved it the same way. Writing, under this model, is not a unique invention. not a singular spark that could only have occurred once, in one place, under exactly the right conditions. It is instead a solution, the solution to a specific and universal problem that arises at a specific level of social organization. Any society that grows large and complex enough will independently converge on something that functions like writing, because the problem is identical for everyone who reaches that level of complexity. This hypothesis has considerable support from the broader history of cultural development. The domestication of dogs, the transition from the wolf to the domesticated animal that has lived in human settlements for 15,000 years, appears to have happened independently in at least two different regions, once in Europe and once in East Asia. The pressure was the same in both cases: scavenging wolves at the edges of human campsites, selecting themselves over generations for tolerance of human proximity, gradually transitioning from competitor to companion. Same environmental pressure, same solution, two independent origins. The development of agriculture is even more striking. Farming, the deliberate cultivation of plants and the management of animals for food, arose independently in at least 7 distinct regions of the world: the Fertile Crescent of the ancient Middle East, the Yellow River Valley in China, the New Guinea highlands, the savannas of West Africa, the highlands of central Mexico, the Andes of South America, and the eastern woodlands of North America. Same underlying pressure: more people, insufficient wild food, need for reliable supply. 7 independent solutions, all converging on the same essential answer: plant it, tend it, harvest it, store it, plan for next year. Writing, under the independent invention hypothesis, would follow the same logic. Both Uruk and Abydos had reached a level of social complexity that made external storage of information necessary. Both had available materials: clay in the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, bone and ivory in the Nile Valley, suitable for holding marks. Both had administrative contexts: the temple economy of Uruk, the royal court of pre-dynastic Abydos, that generated exactly the kind of transactional record-keeping that proto-writing was designed to handle. And so both, independently, arrived at the same idea: marks that stand for quantities, labels that travel with goods, signs that carry information from one person to another and from one moment to another, without requiring the physical presence of the person who first knew it. This would mean that human cognitive development, combined with sufficient social complexity, reliably produces something like writing, that the invention is not an accident of genius in one particular place, but an almost inevitable emergence at a particular threshold of civilization, one that any sufficiently complex society will reach, given enough time. The second possibility is stimulus diffusion. This is more nuanced, and it is where most specialists have come to rest, provisionally, with all the appropriate caveats that the evidence requires. Under this model, the idea of writing, not the signs, not the specific conventions of proto-cuneiform or proto-hieroglyphic, but the abstract concept that marks on surfaces can hold information, that external memory is possible, that a small carved object can travel with a jar and tell the recipient something useful, travels from Mesopotamia to Egypt through some channel of contact. Not the writing system itself, the concept, perhaps through merchants following the trade routes documented by the imports in Tomb UJ, perhaps through diplomatic exchanges between the courts of pre-dynastic Egypt and the city-states of the Levant, perhaps through a chain of intermediaries, craftsmen, traders, itinerant specialists, none of whom fully understood what they were transmitting, each passing along a partial description of something they had heard or seen, attenuated by distance and translation and the normal distortions of second-hand knowledge. The people in the East, apparently, use marks pressed into clay to remember what they have in their warehouses. The history of technology, is full of stimulus diffusion events, and some of them have been documented carefully enough to show us what the mechanism looks like in practice. The knowledge that iron smelting was possible, that iron could be extracted from ore and worked into tools harder and sharper than bronze, spread across the ancient world in the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, in a pattern that looks very much like stimulus diffusion. The specific techniques were not immediately transmitted. The specific type of furnace, the exact temperature required, the charcoal to ore ratios that determined the quality of the metal. These were the proprietary knowledge of skilled ironworkers and spread slowly, imperfectly, through direct contact and apprenticeship. But the knowledge that the thing was possible, that iron could be made into tools, that iron tools were harder and sharper and more durable than bronze, spread faster through trade contacts and diplomatic interactions and the simple observation of iron objects moving through markets. Communities that had no iron workers yet knew that iron was a thing that existed, that it could be made, and that someone nearby had it. That knowledge motivated the acquisition of the technique, even before the technique was available. The printing press shows a similar pattern at a different scale and a different speed. Gutenberg's specific mechanism, the movable type, the oil-based ink, the modified screw press, was not immediately replicated everywhere it became known. But the concept, that text could be reproduced mechanically in large numbers at low cost, spread through Europe within decades and motivated many different inventors in many different places to develop their own solutions to the same problem. The solutions varied in their technical implementations, but converged on the same fundamental idea: permission, not technique. The knowledge that it was possible opened the field. Under stimulus diffusion, Egypt doesn't copy Mesopotamia's writing system. The idea arrives, blurred, imprecise, stripped of its specific implementation, and Egypt does the rest. Egypt hears that this is possible and invents its own version, from scratch, suited to its own language and its own administrative needs and its own visual tradition. The input from Mesopotamia is not a template, it is a permission. It is the knowledge that the thing is possible, which, in the history of human achievement, is often the most important knowledge of all. This is why the two writing systems share no signs. They are independently designed solutions to the same problem, built on the same foundational idea that arrived, in some form, through the channels of ancient trade. The concept crossed the desert, the signs did not. The third possibility is direct borrowing, and this is the one that nearly everyone who has studied the question carefully ends up rejecting. And the reason it is rejected is elegant enough to be worth pausing on. If Egypt had directly borrowed Mesopotamia's writing system, if Egyptian scribes had sat with proto-cuneiform tablets and adapted the signs for their own language and their own administrative context, we would expect to find shared signs. We would expect to see proto-cuneiform forms showing up, modified or simplified, in early Egyptian writing. This is how borrowing works in the history of writing, and the examples are numerous and well documented. The Greek alphabet borrows from Phoenician, and the family resemblance is visible in the forms of the letters. The Phoenician letter Aleph, an ox head, becomes the Greek alpha, rotated. Beth, a house, becomes beta. The shapes transform, the sounds adapt, but the structural DNA of the parent system is visible in the child system. Persian cuneiform borrows from Babylonian cuneiform. The shapes are modified, the phonology is adapted, but the relationship is undeniable and easily documented. The Korean Hangul script borrows structural logic from Chinese characters. Japanese hiragana and katakana both derive from Chinese, simplified and stylized, but still traceable to their origins. When one writing system borrows from another, it leaves traces. Proto-cuneiform and proto-hieroglyphic share no signs. The visual logic of the two systems has no demonstrable overlap. not a single sign in the one that can be credibly traced to a sign in the other. The pictographic conventions are completely different. The organizational principles are different. Even the materials, wet clay versus bone or stone or papyrus, produce a different visual language, pressed wedge shapes versus drawn or carved outlines. If someone sat with a proto-cuneiform tablet and tried to design a system for Egyptian, they would produce something that looks at least partly cuneiform. Hieroglyphics do not look at all cuneiform. The absence of shared signs is the strong evidence against direct borrowing. It is also the strong evidence that whatever contact produced these two parallel systems, and there was contact, as we'll establish when we look at the knife handle and the other evidence. What travelled was abstract, conceptual, the idea, not the implementation. And here is the honest caveat that I want to lay under all three of these possibilities, because tonight's integrity depends on it. 4 premium framing, W5 reinforced, W40 min. The conventional Mesopotamian dating, the sequence that puts Uruk 4 at approximately 3350 to 3200 BC, and therefore narrowly ahead of the Abydos bone tags at 3320 to 3150 BC, rests substantially on one stratigraphic column at one site. The deep sounding in the Anu Ziggurat area at Uruk, excavated over many seasons by the German Archaeological Institute, is the anchor for the entire conventional chronology of this period. It is careful, systematic, well-documented work, but it is one column, one hole in the ground, and the calibration curves for radiocarbon dating in the late 4th millennium BC happen to run through a plateau, a section of the curve where the mathematical relationship between radiocarbon age and calendar age is almost flat, where a single measurement can resolve to multiple possible calendar dates spanning a century or more. In practice, what this means is that the margin between the Mesopotamian tablets and the Egyptian tags, a margin that currently appears to be somewhere between 50 and 150 years, with Uruk ahead, falls entirely within the uncertainty range of the methods we use to establish it. We cannot, with our current tools, definitively say that Uruk was earlier. We can say, it appears to be earlier, on current evidence, with appropriate humility about what current evidence means. Archaeology's best answers are always provisional, not wrong, provisional. Built from the best available evidence, subject to revision when new evidence emerges. And the Abydos evidence already revised the picture once, in 1998. It could be revised again. Another tomb, another site, another carefully excavated assemblage. Any of these could move the finish line. This is not defeatism, it is honesty. And in a conversation about the origins of human knowledge, about the very first attempts to make the past permanent, honesty about what we know and don't know seems like the appropriate register. There is a third answer to tonight's question, and it is 6,000 years older than either of the answers we've been discussing. We will reach it after we've scored the full race, and when we get there, it will change what the question means, not invalidate it, but deepen it. 4 races, 4 different measures of what first means when applied to a civilization. 4 answers, none of them simple. Let's run them one at a time. The word city covers an enormous range in the history of human settlement, and archaeologists and historians have spent considerable energy trying to agree on a useful definition. For tonight's purposes, for the purpose of identifying the world's first city, let's use the definition that has the widest acceptance among specialists. A city is a settlement with functional specialization, with monumental public architecture, and with enough social surplus that not everyone needs to produce food. Functional specialization means that different people do different things. Farmers grow food, potters make vessels, weavers produce cloth, scribes keep records, priests perform rituals, builders construct, merchants trade. The division of labor is stable, encoded in the settlement's social structure, and the economy produces enough surplus that the non-food producers can be sustained by the food producers' output. Monumental public architecture means buildings or structures that exceed the functional needs of any individual household. Things built on a scale or with a permanence that communicate something about collective identity, sacred order, or political authority. A house is not monumental. A warehouse is not monumental. A temple on a 4-meter raised platform, visible from miles away, decorated with cone mosaics, and approached by monumental staircases, that is monumental. Social surplus means that the food production is efficient enough to free some portion of the population from producing food entirely. When the farmer can produce enough to feed himself and several others, the others can be scribes or soldiers or potters or builders or priests. The surplus is what makes specialization possible, and specialization is what makes a city different from a very large village. By all of these measures, Uruk in southern Mesopotamia was the world's first city, and it was not close. The Eanna district, the sacred precinct dedicated to the sky goddess Eanna, covered approximately 40 hectares of the settlement's central area. Within it, the White Temple stood on a 4-meter mud brick platform, its approach marked by monumental staircases that would have required years of labor to construct. The cone mosaic walls, thousands of small terracotta and bitumen cones pressed into wet plaster in geometric patterns of red, black, and white, created a visual effect that anyone approaching the city across the flat plain of southern Iraq would have seen from several miles away. This was not building for shelter. This was building for visibility, for communication, for the proclamation of power and sacred significance to everyone within sight. Around the Eanna and extending across a settlement area estimated at somewhere between 200 and 500 hectares, the evidence for the outer boundaries is incomplete, were the workshops, warehouses, canal quays, administrative buildings, and residential areas of a fully functioning urban economy. Specialist potters producing wheel-thrown, beveled-rim bowls by the thousands. Mass-produced standardized containers for rations. The ancient equivalent of a cafeteria tray, so standardized in their dimensions that scholars believe they were made with a simple wooden mold rather than crafted individually. Every worker in the Eanna complex received their grain or their beer in these bowls, and the bowls accumulated in the rubbish layers in such quantities that Uruk period deposits across the ancient Near East can often be dated and culturally identified just by the presence of these humble, standardized vessels. Specialist weavers producing cloth in quantities recorded on the administrative tablets. The textile production of Uruk was not a cottage industry. It was a managed economy, with workshops tracking the wool received, the labor hours applied, and the finished product distributed or traded. The tablets record not just the output, but the workers, women and children, named or numbered, their daily rations of barley or beer set against their daily output of thread or cloth in the kind of ledger that would not look unfamiliar to a factory manager in the 19th century. Specialist metalworkers, specialist boat builders, specialist brewers, managing the grain fermentation on a scale that suggests beer production was as much a strategic resource as wheat storage. And the scribes, in training, in practice, in supervision, producing and filing and storing the tablets that would eventually number in the thousands. The training of a Uruk period scribe began with the thematic lists, long, organized inventories of signs grouped by category that the student copied out repeatedly until the signs were in the hand as much as in the mind. A list of trees, a list of animals, a list of occupational titles, a list of stone vessels. These lists survive in multiple copies, clearly copied from a master by students whose individual styles, tighter or looser, more confident or more tentative in the impression, give them away as different hands. The curriculum was standardized. The same lists appear, with minor variations, in multiple cities over hundreds of years, which tells us that the scribal training was itself an institution, preserving its methods across the generations with the stability of a professional guild. You can see the students' mistakes in the clay, a sign pressed at the wrong angle, corrected with an overlying impression, a column that starts confident and ends cramped because the student misjudged the space. The population of Uruk at its height, somewhere in the range of 3200 to 2900 BC, is estimated, using the settlement area and comparisons with other well-documented early urban sites, at between 25,000 and 80,000 people. The uncertainty is large because the evidence is incomplete. But even the lower number, 25,000 people inside one wall, sustained by the irrigated agriculture of the surrounding plain, would have been the largest human concentration on Earth to that point in history. For context, a typical Neolithic European village had a few hundred to a few thousand residents. The pre-dynastic settlements of Egypt's Nile Valley had populations in the low thousands at their largest. Uruk was an order of magnitude beyond anything that had existed before it, and the reach of Uruk extended beyond its walls in ways that archaeologists began to understand fully only in the 1970s and 1980s. Survey work across the broader ancient Middle East revealed what is now called the Uruk expansion, a period in the late 4th millennium when the distinctive ceramic assemblage, the administrative tools and writing system, and the architectural styles of the Uruk culture appeared, suddenly, in consolidated deposits at sites hundreds of kilometers from Uruk itself. In southeastern Turkey, along the bend of the Euphrates, in northern Syria at Habuba Kabira and Tel Kanas, where what appear to be entire Uruk culture settlements were established on the Syrian steppe, on the Iranian plateau at Godin Tepe and Susa. These were not casual trade contacts. They were, apparently, outposts or colonies of the Uruk sphere, communities following Uruk cultural practices, maintaining the Uruk writing system, connected to the city by river routes and overland tracks. The sphere of Uruk's cultural influence, at its height, was the largest any single settlement had ever achieved. Egypt, at 3200 BC, had nothing comparable. This is worth being clear about, because it is sometimes obscured by enthusiasm for Egyptian achievements. Hierakonpolis, the largest identified pre-dynastic settlement in Upper Egypt, may have had a peak population of around 10,000, a substantial town. It had ceremonial buildings. It had a brewery operating at a significant scale. It had evidence of organized craft production and long-distance trade. But 10,000 people in a town is not 25,000 people in a city. And Hierakonpolis lacked the monumental architecture, the functional specialization at urban scale, and the administrative complexity that Uruk possessed by 3200 BC. The first city on Earth was in Mesopotamia. Cities, Uruk, decisively, and without serious challenge. 1998 is relevant here, not just because of Dreyer's publication on Tomb Uj, but because of what the tomb itself tells us about the political world that produced it. Tomb Uj was built by someone who was a king of Upper Egypt, a ruler of the southern corridor, from roughly the first cataract north to somewhere around modern-day Asyut. But Upper Egypt was not Egypt. The delta, the broad fan of the Nile's mouth with its multiple channels and its distinct geography and culture, was a separate political entity. The two regions, the two lands as the Egyptians would always call them, even after unification, had different rulers and different traditions and different relationships to the resources of the river. And then, around a century after Tomb Uj was sealed, everything changed. Around 3100 BC, the date varies slightly depending on which chronological scheme you follow, but the general period is clear. A king of Upper Egypt moved north and conquered the delta. He unified the two lands under a single administration. He established what became the First Dynasty, a continuous royal succession that would run for centuries. He created, in other words, a country. The king we call Narmer, and it is possible that Narmer is a different ruler from the Scorpion who may be in Tomb Uj, or possible that they are the same individual known by different names. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous, is commemorated on one of the most famous objects in Egyptian archaeology, the Narmer palette. A flat stone cosmetic palette, 63 centimeters tall, carved on both faces in low relief. On one face, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt and raises a mace to strike a kneeling enemy. On the other face, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt and surveys a field of decapitated enemies with their heads arranged between their feet. The imagery of the two crowns on the two faces is not casual decoration. It is a political statement. This king wears both crowns because he rules both lands. Unification around 3100 BC, and the state that it created persisted in its fundamental structure and its fundamental identity for 3,000 years. Think about the scale of that number, 3,000 years. Egypt's pharaonic tradition ran from Narmer, around 3100 BC, to the conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, and in some diminished form continued through the Ptolemaic period to Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, nearly 3,100 years. The Old Kingdom, which built the pyramids, and the New Kingdom, which produced Ramesses the Great and Tutankhamun and the Battle of Kadesh, were part of the same continuous civilization. They shared the same writing system, hieroglyphics, continuously evolved but recognizably consistent for 3 millennia. They worshipped the same gods: Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ra, Amun, adapted and syncretized and reinterpreted across the centuries, but identifiably the same divine pantheon. They were administered by a bureaucracy that traced its institutional memory back, in principle, to Narmer. For comparison, the United States has existed for 250 years. The Roman Empire, from the traditional founding of Rome to the fall of the Western Empire, spans roughly 1,200 years. The Byzantine continuation of the Eastern Empire lasted another 1,000. Egypt ran its one recognizable system for 3,100 years, and it was doing this from the beginning, from Narmer, who established the template that persisted. The scale of Egyptian continuity becomes clearest when you think about it in terms of the things that stayed the same rather than the things that changed. Hieroglyphic writing, in its essential structural logic, the combination of phonetic signs and determinatives and logograms in the same text, persisted from the pre-dynastic period through to the late Roman era, a span of over 3,000 years. The same script being read by trained specialists continuously. For comparison, the Latin alphabet used to write this script has been in continuous use for about 2,500 years, and we consider that remarkable. The pantheon of Egyptian gods, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ra, Thoth, Anubis, Hathor, Sekhmet, Amun, persisted in recognizable form for the same period. The mythology evolved, the relationships between gods shifted, the dominant cult changed with the political fashions of the dynasty. But the gods themselves were continuous. A priest of Amun in the New Kingdom would have recognized and could have participated in the worship of Osiris performed in the Old Kingdom. The rites, the hymns, the conceptual framework of the afterlife, continuously transmitted, generation after generation, by the professional priesthood that formed the backbone of Egyptian religious life. The bureaucratic forms, the organization of the state into nomes, the administrative hierarchy from the pharaoh through the vizier to the district governors, the system of royal warehouses and redistribution, persisted for most of that 3,000 years with modifications but without fundamental restructuring. Egypt was administered by a system that had been designed, in its essentials, in the early dynastic period, and that system proved robust enough to survive the Hyksos invasion, the Amarna heresy, the Sea Peoples, repeated periods of internal fragmentation, and decades of foreign rule under Libyan and Nubian and Persian dynasties, always reconstituting itself from its own institutional logic when the disruption passed. This is what continuity at scale actually looks like, not changelessness. Egypt changed enormously over 3 millennia, and the culture of the New Kingdom is in many ways unrecognizable from the culture of the early dynastic period. But continuous identity, the thread of institutional memory and religious tradition and administrative practice that linked each generation to the previous one, across 3,000 years of everything else changing around it. Sumer, which had built the world's first city, never achieved this. The city-states of Mesopotamia remained politically fragmented for centuries after Egyptian unification. The first time anyone unified Mesopotamia under a single ruler was Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BC, 800 years after Narmer. And Sargon's Akkadian Empire, impressive as it was, lasted roughly a century and a half before fragmenting. The history of Mesopotamia is a history of repeated unification and fragmentation. Akkadians, then the third dynasty of Ur, then Old Babylon, then the Kassites, then Assyria, then Neo-Babylon, each successor state building on the culture of its predecessors, while the political unit kept collapsing and reforming. Egypt persisted. Countries, Egypt decisively. If you're still following, still awake in whatever hour it is where you are, I want to ask you something. Second comment ritual, 68 Min. The city-states of Mesopotamia and the unified state of Egypt represent two genuinely different answers to the question of how large numbers of human beings should live together. The Mesopotamian city-state offered local identity and civic pride, the protection of your particular city's patron god, the familiar territory of your own streets, the competitive energy of a world where no single power controlled everything, and where your city's fortunes could rise as well as fall. Egypt offered something different: stability, coherence, the security of a system that knew how to manage a flood and a harvest, and distribute resources across 800 miles of river corridor. Neither was obviously superior. Neither was obviously more free. People who lived in both worlds, if we can read their surviving words, expressed both pride in their system and anxiety about its demands. If you had a choice, which would you take? Leave your answer below. There is no right answer, and I am genuinely curious. It is in room 636 of the Louvre's Richelieu wing. You could go to Paris and see it tomorrow if you chose to. It is small, 9.5 centimeters long, carved from hippopotamus ivory in low relief, designed to be fitted to a flint blade that is long since lost. The handle was purchased by a French collector from an Egyptian antiques dealer around 1914. There is no excavation record. The scholarly consensus places it in the Gebel El Arak region of Upper Egypt and dates it to approximately 3300 to 3100 BC, the same horizon as Tomb Uj at Abydos, the same period we have been discussing tonight. On one face of the handle, a battle scene, warriors fighting, the dead arrayed in rows, a commanding figure surveying the carnage. This imagery is Egyptian, consistent with late pre-dynastic iconography, the style found on other objects of this period, the sort of commemorative violence that appears on the earliest Egyptian royal monuments, stylized but recognizable. On the other face, a figure standing erect between two lions. The lions are on their hind legs, one on either side of the central figure, perfectly symmetrical. The central figure is bearded, wearing a long robe and a distinctive hat. He holds the lions by their manes. one in each hand, arms extended, a pose of controlled dominance. This pose, the central figure flanked by two symmetrical animals, which he grasps and subdues, is not Egyptian. It has no independent origin in the Egyptian artistic tradition. It is not found in pre-dynastic Egyptian art, except on objects that show this kind of hybrid iconography. It is, however, extremely well documented in Mesopotamian art of the Uruk period, appearing on cylinder seals, on stone vessels, on elaborate ceremonial objects, in the iconographic vocabulary of a tradition that used this image to represent royal or divine authority over the natural world. Art historians call it the Master of Animals motif. It is one of the most distinctive and continuously recurring images in early Mesopotamian iconography. On the Gebel el-Arak knife handle, it appears in Egypt. On an object of undeniably Egyptian manufacture, hippopotamus ivory, obtained only in the Nile Valley, Egyptian carving tools and conventions evident in the style, Egyptian battle scene on the obverse, there is an image drawn from the Mesopotamian visual tradition. This is not the only such evidence. 5 premium frame-in. Cylinder seals, the small stone rollers used in Mesopotamia to roll administrative impressions into clay, have been found in Egyptian contexts dated to this period, some of them apparently made locally in imitation of Mesopotamian forms. Niched facade mud brick architecture, a distinctive decorative style found on the monumental buildings of Uruk, in which the exterior walls are articulated with a regular pattern of projecting pilasters and recessed panels, appears on some early Egyptian royal tomb enclosures in a form that architectural historians consider too specific and too unusual to have been independently invented. And then there are the Levantine wine jars in Tomb Uj, not just individual imported objects, but a trade network large enough to transport hundreds of jars of wine from the eastern Mediterranean to a royal burial in Upper Egypt. The evidence, taken together, tells us something clear and something important. Egypt and Mesopotamia were not isolated from each other during the critical period when both were developing writing, building complex institutions, and creating the cultural foundations of everything that followed. They were in contact. At what remove, through how many intermediaries, how frequently, and how intensively, we cannot specify with precision. But the contact was real. Things were moving between them. Goods, certainly. Images, apparently. Ideas, almost certainly. And this reframes the question we started with, in a direction I find more interesting than the original. The emergence of civilization in Egypt and in Mesopotamia was not, apparently, entirely independent. These were not two sealed experiments running in parallel, completely unaware of each other, by pure coincidence arriving at similar solutions within the same century and a half. They were, in some sense, in dialogue, an extremely slow and mediated and imprecise dialogue across 1,500 kilometers, but a dialogue nonetheless. The development of each may have been accelerated by some awareness of the other. The knowledge that the thing was possible, that marks on surfaces could hold information, that large numbers of people could be organized under a single administration, that the complexity of the world could be managed, may have been shared, however imperfectly, between the Nile and the Euphrates. Let's move quickly through the remaining categories. No rhetoric, just the honest scores. The wheel, Mesopotamia. The earliest evidence for wheeled vehicles, pictographic signs and a handful of actual wheel fragments, comes from the Uruk period and the immediately following Jemdet Nasser period, roughly 3500 to 2900 BC, across a zone of early Mesopotamian cultural influence. The Egyptian archaeological record shows no evidence for the wheel in transportation until roughly 1700 BC, when the Hyksos brought horse-drawn chariots into Egypt from the north, and the Egyptians adopted and developed the technology into one of the most effective military tools of the ancient world. But as a fundamental technology, the wheel itself, Mesopotamia had it first, by almost 2,000 years in terms of its appearance in Egypt. The plough, Mesopotamia, probably. Pictographic signs that appear to represent ploughs appear in proto-cuneiform from around 3000 BC, and the evidence for systematic plough agriculture in the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, the characteristic field stripe patterns visible in the archaeological landscape, the record of oxen used in traction, predates the textual record by some margin. Egypt also developed plough technology early, but the Mesopotamian evidence is more clearly documented in this period. The 365-day calendar, Egypt. The observation of the Nile's annual flood correlated with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the first morning of the year when the star Sirius becomes visible above the horizon just before dawn, which the Egyptians recognized as a reliable predictor of the flood's arrival, gave Egyptian astronomers and administrators the data to calculate a civil calendar of 365 days, 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 additional epigomenal days associated in mythology with the birthdays of the major gods. This is the calendar that passed to Rome through the Julian reforms of 45 BC and to the modern world through the Gregorian reform of 1582. Every year you have ever lived has been 365 days, or 366, in the leap year adjustment that was also worked out in antiquity, because Egyptian astronomers counted the days between floods for long enough to get the number right. Monumental stone architecture, Egypt, and not close. The step pyramid of Djoser, built at Saqqara under the architect Imhotep around 2650 BC, is the world's first large-scale stone structure. It rises 62 meters in 6 tiers, covers a base of approximately 140 by 118 meters, and is built almost entirely of cut limestone. Nothing in Mesopotamia, nothing in any other civilization of this period, comes close. The mud brick platforms of Uruk, large and impressive as they were built of materials that dissolved and required constant reconstruction. The step pyramid is still standing. You can photograph it. Law codes, Mesopotamia, by tradition. The most famous law code of the ancient world, the Code of Hammurabi, around 1754 BC, with its 282 specific provisions covering everything from property rights to medical malpractice to the wages of ox drivers, is a Babylonian document that builds on a much older Mesopotamian tradition of codified legal precedent. The Code of Ur-Nammu, from around 2100 BC, is the oldest surviving law code and predates Hammurabi by 3.5 centuries. Egypt had laws, certainly. The pharaoh's word was law, and there are Egyptian legal texts of considerable sophistication. But the tradition of writing the law down in a comprehensive and publicly accessible form is more strongly associated with Mesopotamia. Formal education, Mesopotamia. The Sumerian Ejuba, the tablet house or scribal school, is documented in cuneiform texts from the 3rd millennium BC and represents the oldest clearly identified educational institution in the world. Scribal training in Egypt was also formalized and professional, but the Mesopotamian evidence for a specifically institutionalized school with a curriculum and teaching texts and student exercises that survive in large quantities is earlier and better documented. Medicine, Egypt. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical document in its surviving form from roughly 1600 BC, but believed to derive from a source text perhaps 1,000 years older, describes 48 surgical cases in a format that is striking in its rationalism. Each case is described under headings: examination findings, diagnosis, prognosis, treatment. The language is clinical and systematic. Case 6, for example, describes a wound to the head with exposed bone. The papyrus notes the skull sutures, recognizes the significance of brain tissue being visible through a wound, and categorizes the case as an ailment not to be treated. This is not prayer, this is medicine. Egypt. Literature. Mesopotamia holds the earliest, though the margin is tighter than it once seemed. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest narrative poem in the world, the oldest story with a named protagonist, the oldest exploration of what it means to lose someone you love, exists in multiple versions across 1,000 years of cuneiform tablets. The earliest computable elements dating to the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BC, though the stories it encodes are clearly older, drawn from Sumerian narrative traditions that predate the Akkadian version by centuries. The poem's central grief, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, losing his companion Enkidu, and then refusing to accept that loss, going to the ends of the earth to find the secret of immortality and failing, is as clear and as immediate as anything written last year. The fear of death, the love for a friend, the desperate need to believe that something survives the grave. 5,000 years ago, in Uruk, someone wrote this down. Someone decided it was important enough to preserve. Egypt's literary tradition is slightly later in its surviving forms, but equally remarkable in its sophistication. The pyramid texts, inscribed on the walls of royal burial chambers from around 2400 BC, are among the oldest religious texts in the world, a complex set of spells and hymns and narrative passages meant to guide the dead king through the underworld and secure his place among the gods. The coffin texts that followed, and the Book of the Dead that developed from these are not simple prayers, they are elaborate narratives, mapping an imagined landscape of the afterlife with the kind of geographical specificity that suggests generations of ritual development, refined over centuries. And Egypt's love poetry, surviving in papyri from the New Kingdom around 1300 BC, is as surprising as anything in the ancient world. Casual, personal, funny. I passed by the door of my beloved and I knocked, and it did not open. An excellent night for me. The doorpost spoke to me. Playful, melancholy, entirely human. Literature, perhaps. Mesopotamia on timing, Egypt on longevity and range. Astronomy, Egypt for the practical calendar, Mesopotamia for the mathematical framework beneath it. The Babylonian astronomical tradition, which built directly on Sumerian foundations, produced the most sophisticated predictive astronomy of the ancient world. The Babylonians tracked the movements of the visible planets over hundreds of years, built mathematical models to predict their positions, and could predict lunar eclipses with considerable accuracy using a method they called the Saros cycle, an 18-year, 11-day period after which the Sun, Moon, and Earth return to the same relative positions, meaning that an eclipse pattern from one Saros cycle repeats, with modifications, in the next. This is not casual observation. It is the application of mathematical pattern recognition to centuries of accumulated data, the earliest predictive science in the world, in the modern sense of science as a method. Egypt's astronomical contributions, while real and important for calendar making, did not reach this level of mathematical abstraction. Sculpture and the visual arts, both, simultaneously, extraordinarily. Uruk produces the Waka vase, a metre-tall alabaster vessel carved in registers, one of the finest works of art of the 4th millennium, showing a procession bearing offerings to the goddess Eanna. Egypt produces the Nama palette and, slightly later, the massive royal statuary of the Old Kingdom, the seated scribe statues with their painted eyes, the reserve heads of the 4th dynasty with their unsettling realism, the colossal statues of Ramesses II, whose sheer physical scale can make even a modern visitor stop in their tracks. Both civilizations produced visual art of extraordinary technical accomplishment and emotional range. This one goes to both, no single winner. Two traditions, two visions of what the human form could mean carved in stone. Burial, Egypt, uniquely and decisively. No civilization in the ancient world, not Mesopotamia, not the Indus Valley, not China, not Mesoamerica, invested in the physical preservation of the dead with the intensity that Egypt sustained for 3,000 years. Mummification, the systematic removal and preservation of internal organs, the treatment of the body with natron salt, the wrapping in linen, the elaborate coffin systems with their inscribed protections, represents a technological and ideological commitment to the body's survival that has no close parallel elsewhere. The result is that we have Egyptian remains. We know what some of these people looked like. We can study their health, their diet, their diseases, the work their bodies show in their bones, the traumas they survived, and the ones that killed them. We cannot do this for Mesopotamia, where the alkaline soil of the alluvial plain has consumed organic remains. Egypt's theology of the afterlife gave us, by accident, a physiology of the past. Beer, a genuine draw, and I mention it specifically because it is one of the few areas where the evidence from both civilizations is rich, early, and roughly contemporaneous. Both Uruk and pre-dynastic Egypt had large-scale beer production integrated into their administrative systems. The proto-cuneiform tablets record beer rations as a standard component of worker compensation. Egypt has brewery evidence from Hierakonpolis dated to the pre-dynastic period. Both civilizations loved beer. Neither can claim priority. This one is a draw between friends who should simply drink together. And now, the number I seeded at the end of the last wave, the one hiding in your daily life. Replay fact seed, EMPS 84 min, full payment in segment 8. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This is Sumerian mathematics, base 60, the sexagesimal system, and it is the oldest surviving mathematical convention still in unaltered daily use in the modern world. Everything else from 5,000 years ago has been replaced, modified, or abandoned. The wheel is unchanged in principle, but unrecognizable in its materials and engineering. The plough is now a machine. Writing has been transformed beyond recognition. But the 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour are unchanged from their Mesopotamian origins. We will come back to this. It deserves a longer treatment than a single sentence, and it will get one. The overall scorecard, no single civilization sweeps. Both were extraordinary. Both contributed technologies and ideas that are still with us. They were not versions of each other. They were two genuinely different experiments in what a civilization could be. And both, by any reasonable measure, succeeded in ways that resonate 5,000 years later. Now, the place I've been holding back. The third answer to tonight's question. W4 Echo. The one that predates both Uruk and Abydos by 6,000 years, and that forces us to reconsider what the word civilization means when we apply it to the things human beings do. Southeastern Turkey, a landscape of pale limestone hills, dry and rolling, the kind of terrain where in summer the light is very bright and flat, and the soil between the rocks is thin and cracked. Hawks circle on the thermals. The wind moves the dead grass. There are no rivers here, not the Tigris, not the Euphrates, not the Nile. This is the high ground between the river valleys, the transitional zone where the mountains of Anatolia begin to flatten out toward the plains of northern Syria. On a ridge here, a modest limestone mound, 15 meters high, unremarkable in the landscape, there is something that has been waiting underground for 11,000 years. Modern Turkish, Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill, a name given by the people of the nearby village of Uruk, because the hill is rounded on top in a way that reminded someone of a belly. It appears in regional archaeological surveys from the 1960s. It was noted, categorized as probable Byzantine era and not prioritized. Byzantine sites are common in southeastern Turkey. They are not usually what changes the history of the world. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited the site as part of a broader survey of the region. He looked at the flint tools eroding from the surface, microliths and blades that he recognized as belonging to the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period that preceded agriculture, a period anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 years ago. He looked at the shape of the mound. He understood that what was under it was not Byzantine. The excavations that followed, conducted over many seasons from 1995 until Schmidt's death in 2014, and continuing under Turkish direction after, revealed one of the most significant sites in the history of human archaeology. W4 paid 100 min. Göbekli Tepe was built approximately 9,600 BC, 11,600 years ago. It is the oldest monumental architecture yet identified on Earth, and it predates the proto-cuneiform tablets of Uruk by approximately 6,000 years. It predates the bone tags of Abydos by approximately 6,000 years. It predates the development of agriculture in this region by at least a millennium, possibly considerably more, depending on the specific site and the definition of agriculture used. 6,000 years before writing, 6,000 years before cities, before bronze tools, before the wheel, before pottery in this part of the world, before the domestication of cattle or sheep or goat or pig at this location, before the concept of a harvest, before the concept of a granary, before the concept of storing surplus food for a future year, before almost everything we associate with the word civilization, someone built this. The structures at Göbekli Tepe are roughly elliptical enclosures, ranging from about 10 to 30 meters in internal diameter, each arranged around a central pair of large T-shaped pillars surrounded by a ring of smaller pillars set into the enclosure walls. The pillars are the most distinctive feature, T-shaped in cross-section, the horizontal top element forming a flat head-like projection, the vertical shaft forming what might be a body. The scale is extraordinary for any period, let alone this one. The largest pillars stand approximately 5 to 6 meters above their base. The heaviest weigh an estimated 10 to 20 tons. They are cut from the local limestone. There is a quarry nearby, where unfinished pillars can still be seen lying in the bedrock, incompletely extracted, abandoned at some point in the distant past, and they are carved with tools made entirely of flint and bone. No metal, no wheel, no pulley. Flint tools, wooden levers, ropes made from plant fiber, and the coordinated effort of human bodies. And yet here they stand, or here they were standing, until they were deliberately knocked over and buried. Massive carved stone pillars, arranged in geometric precision, in circles on a hillside in southeastern Turkey, 11,600 years ago. The surface of many pillars carries carved imagery in low relief. Animals, primarily, foxes, rendered with careful attention to the texture of their fur suggested by diagonal hatching, boars with bristling spines, cranes in flight, their wings outstretched, their long necks extended, the crane being, in many ancient traditions, a bird of transition between worlds. Vultures, wings spread above headless human figures in at least one famous composition that has been interpreted as a scene of excarnation, the exposure of the dead for birds to consume, a ritual defleshing practice attested in other Neolithic sites. Scorpions, their tails raised in threat, spiders, snakes coiling in spirals around the shafts of pillars or carved in bands across the surfaces, and this is the detail that strikes many visitors as the most affecting and the hardest to process. On some pillars, carved at approximately the height where a human's arms would hang when standing, there are low-relief human hands, fingers spread, forearms reaching down the shaft of the pillar, as if the pillar itself is a being, a person, a figure standing in the circle with its hands at its sides, facing inward, part of whatever ceremony or gathering this place was built for. The enclosures were not homes. There is no evidence of sustained domestic occupation at Göbekli Tepe. No cooking hearths, no food preparation areas, no sleeping spaces, no refuse layers of the kind you find in every site where people live and eat and discard. Göbekli Tepe was visited, maintained, used for purposes that were not domestic. The bones of wild animals, gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, red deer, were found in the fill that eventually buried the enclosures. These animals were not domesticated, they were hunted, and the quantities of bones suggest large-scale communal feasting events, the kind of gathering where many people come together to hunt and eat, and presumably to perform whatever rituals the carved pillars presided over. Sensory regrounding. In that place, in that season, someone lit a fire, and the smoke rose into the clear, cold air, and the carved animals on the stone pillars caught the firelight. There is one additional feature of Göbekli Tepe that deserves more than a passing mention, because it speaks to something about the people who built it that the carved animals alone do not convey. The enclosures were not all built at once. They were built in sequence, over centuries, possibly over several thousand years, each new enclosure constructed as the previous ones were being filled and sealed. The archaeology shows a pattern of deliberate renewal. Seal what was, build anew above it, maintain the site across generations that had no shared memory of what had come before, except the site itself and the tradition of its use. The people who were building new enclosures at Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BC had probably never seen the enclosures built at 9600 BC. Those earlier circles were underground, invisible, but the later builders came to the same ridge, used the same materials, carved the same kinds of images, and built the same kinds of structures in the same location, because the location was the location. Because the ridge meant what it had always meant, in an unbroken thread of cultural memory that had no writing, no permanent institutions, no states, no cities, nothing except the stories people told each other, around the fires, in the winter, about what was on the ridge and why it mattered. In 10,000 years, perhaps something like this is what survives of us. A place where humans gathered, the purpose lost, the memory intact, as practice even when the meaning can no longer be explained. There is also an astronomical dimension to Göbekli Tepe that researchers have only begun to examine seriously in the years since Schmidt's death. Several of the enclosures appear to be oriented towards specific points on the horizon, the position of certain stars at their rising or setting, the direction of the midsummer sunrise or the midwinter sunset. The alignments are debated. Not all researchers find them convincing, and the site's complexity makes systematic orientation analysis difficult. But some of the alignments, on the most careful analysis, appear deliberate, which would mean that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were watching the sky, were tracking the movements of stars or sun or moon carefully enough to encode those observations in the orientation of their monuments. Were, in other words, doing a primitive version of the same thing that the Babylonian astronomers would formalize 6,000 years later in their cuneiform eclipse tables, noticing that the sky has a pattern and that the pattern can be used. 6,000 years before writing, and perhaps already beginning to read the sky. Klaus Schmidt proposed in the years before his death a hypothesis that has influenced how archaeologists think about the origins of agriculture. The standard model, farming first, then surplus, then community, then monumental construction, appears to be inverted at Göbekli Tepe. The monument came first. And Schmidt suggested that the need to feed the large gatherings of people coming together at the sanctuary hunters from a wide surrounding region gathering for seasonal ceremonies, may have been one of the pressures that drove the intensive management of wild plant resources in the surrounding hills. That the people who built and used Göbekli Tepe may have begun deliberately cultivating wild cereals, not because cultivation occurred to them as a good idea in the abstract, but because they needed more food than wild gathering could reliably provide for the crowds coming to the ridge. Civilization, in this reading, begins not with a surplus, but with a shared project. Not with food security, but with a vision of something that needed to be built. Not with the practical management of resources, but with a gathering around something numinous, something that mattered enough to drag 10-ton limestone pillars up a ridge using only flint and muscle. This is a hypothesis. The evidence is actively debated, but the possibility it opens is worth sitting with, that what drives human beings to cooperate at the necessary scale to accomplish extraordinary things is not primarily necessity, but meaning, not logistics, but something that the logistics exist to serve. Now, the Sumerian mathematics hiding in your daily life. Replay fact 195 min. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary conventions. They are the survival into the present day of a mathematical system developed in ancient Mesopotamia, the sexagesimal number system, base 60. The choice of 60 as the fundamental base of this system was made in the ancient Near East, probably by the Sumerians, formalized and extended by their Babylonian successors, and it has never been replaced. Every navigation system on Earth uses degrees, minutes, and seconds of arc, sexagesimal coordinates. Every musical rhythm is counted in systems that divide and subdivide, ultimately in patterns rooted in the same mathematical tradition. Every time you say half an hour or a quarter past, you are using the Sumerian division of the hour into 60 equal parts. For comparison, consider everything else from this period that is no longer in use. The cuneiform writing system that recorded this mathematics, gone, replaced so thoroughly that it had to be deciphered as a lost code in the 19th century. The languages of Sumer and Babylon, gone, extinct for 2 millennia, surviving only in tablets that scholars spent generations learning to read. The specific religious practices of the Eanna temple, gone. The political structures of the city-states, gone. The architectural traditions, the pottery styles, the ceramic conventions, all replaced, superseded, transformed beyond recognition. But the 60-second minute remains. The 60-minute hour remains. The 360-degree circle remains. You have been carrying Sumerian mathematics into the 21st century without being aware of it. Every morning when you check the time, every evening when you set an alarm, every time you look at a compass bearing or calculate an angle, Sumer is not past. Part of Sumer is still running. And here is what Göbekli Tepe means for the question that framed tonight. If monumental architecture, the collective construction of something large and permanent that exceeds any practical need, built to communicate something about meaning or sacred order or collective identity, is a measure of civilization, then the answer to who came first is neither Sumer nor Egypt. The answer is a people who built on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey 6,000 years before either civilization existed, and whose name we will never know, whose language we cannot reconstruct, whose belief system we can only partially infer from the carved animals and the strange T-shaped figures standing in their circles. They buried their work, deliberately, carefully, filling the enclosures with rubble and walking away, or not walking away, but constructing new enclosures above the sealed old ones, generation after generation, until the whole hill was a layered archive of buried circles. 6. Premium framing. The deliberate burial is one of the most striking and least explained facts about Göbekli Tepe. It was not collapse, it was not decay, it was intentional. Someone decided that the enclosures should be sealed, and sealed them. We do not know why. We may never know why. The people who built Göbekli Tepe left no written records. Writing would not be invented for 6,000 more years. They left no names, no genealogies, no myths that we can trace to this specific place. They left only the stone. And the stone says, "We gathered here." We had something to say that was worth carving into limestone. We thought the animals were important, the fox and the boar and the crane and the vulture. We thought the figures with hands were important. We came back, generation after generation, to this ridge, and when the time came to close it, we did not abandon it, we buried it, which is itself a kind of care. First is a word that does increasing violence to the evidence the more carefully you look at it. First city, Uruk. First state, Egypt. First writing, a tie, or perhaps Uruk, by a small margin that our methods cannot resolve. First monument, Göbekli Tepe, by 6,000 years. And before Göbekli Tepe, Jericho and Çatalhöyük and Ain Ghazal and a dozen other sites where human beings built settlements of considerable sophistication before any of the things we associate with civilization, writing, cities, states, had been invented. The word first assumes a single starting point. The evidence shows many starting points, overlapping and diverging, converging and separating, across thousands of years of human history. Let's come back now, up from the buried enclosures, up from the dark, back to the surface, back to the two rivers, back to the question that began tonight. Which came first, Sumer or Egypt? The scorecard stated plainly and fairly, cities, Uruk, in southern Mesopotamia, was the world's first city by any reasonable definition, by population, by functional specialization, by the scale and ambition of its public architecture, by the degree to which it had separated the activity of producing food from every other activity that human beings engage in. This was established by 3200 BC and possibly somewhat earlier. Egypt's settlements at the same period were towns, some of them impressive and complex, but none approaching Uruk's scale or integration. Mesopotamia, decisively. A unified country, Egypt, under Nama, around 3100 BC. A single state running 800 miles, with one administration, one writing tradition, one religious system, one person at the top. Established 800 years before anything comparable existed in Mesopotamia, and sustained in its fundamental form for 3,000 years. Egypt, decisively. Writing, a statistical photo finish, with Uruk narrowly ahead on current evidence. The proto-cuneiform tablets from the Eanna district at Uruk conventionally date to approximately 3350 to 3200 BC. The bone tags from Tomb Uj at Abydos conventionally date to approximately 3320 to 3150 BC. On those numbers, Uruk appears earlier, but by a margin that is smaller than the uncertainty inherent in the dating methods. The honest answer is Uruk probably first, by perhaps 50 to 100 years, with the recognition that this margin could be eliminated or reversed by a single new excavation. Monumental architecture, neither Göbekli Tepe, by 6,000 years, built by people who had no cities, no writing, no metal, and no agriculture in any systematic sense, using flint tools and human muscle to raise 10-ton limestone pillars in geometric circles on a ridge in southeastern Turkey around 9600 BC. Continuous survival of a single cultural system, Egypt, over 3,000 years of one recognizable tradition, with no competitor in the ancient world. Now let me pay off the thing I planted early. W5 paid 10,110 min. The conventional Mesopotamian dates, the ones that put Uruk narrowly ahead on writing, that established the Mesopotamia first consensus that was orthodox for most of the 20th century, rest substantially on the stratigraphy of a single deep sounding at the Uruk site. One carefully excavated column through the debris layers of the Anu ziggurat area, matched to pottery sequences and radiocarbon dates, giving us the Uruk IV and Uruk III phases and their approximate calendar equivalents. This is not a weak or careless piece of evidence. It is the foundation of a chronological framework that has been tested and refined over decades, and it holds up well against the available data. But it is one column. And what happened in 1998, when Dreyer published the Abydos bone tags, and the gap between Egyptian and Mesopotamian writing contracted to a statistical tie, demonstrates exactly how much rests on that one column. The consensus that Mesopotamia preceded Egypt by a few centuries held for most of the 20th century precisely because no one had found Egyptian writing that was clearly as early as the Uruk material. Once they did, the framework had to accommodate the new evidence. And it revealed that the margin was much smaller than the old framework had suggested. This could happen again. The archaeological database for this period, the late 4th millennium BC, is large, but it is not exhaustive. There may be Egyptian sites with writing as early as, or earlier than, the Abydos tags. There may be sites in Mesopotamia with writing earlier than the current Uruk IV phase. We don't know, because we haven't found them yet, or because what we've found hasn't been fully excavated, or because the evidence is there but hasn't been recognized for what it is. Archaeology is not a completed project. It is an ongoing conversation between the present and the past is still producing new evidence. What does this mean for tonight's question? Not that the answer is unknowable, not that we should retreat into comfortable agnosticism. It means that the answer is provisional, the best answer at this moment, with these methods at these sites, and that we should hold it with appropriate precision. We know the events were close, we know the margin is small, we believe Uruk was somewhat earlier on writing, on current evidence. We acknowledge that the evidence could change. Archaeology's best knowledge is always honest knowledge, and honest knowledge sometimes looks like we're not certain, we're close, but we're not certain. Now, the resolution. Now, the resolution. Master Loop, resolved, to undo. Sumer and Egypt were not a sequence. This is the thing I most want you to take from tonight. Not the scorecard, not the specific answers, but the underlying structure of what the evidence shows. They were not an original and a copy, not a before and an after, not a stone and a ripple, the way the old diffusion model had it. They were two simultaneous responses to the same underlying human condition, the condition of having too many people, too much complexity, too many decisions and transactions and seasonal records for the old informal methods of management to handle. Both societies hit that wall at roughly the same moment. Both invented writing. Both built complex political hierarchies. Both produced monumental architecture. Both developed elaborate religious traditions that required professional specialists and formal training, and sacred calendars. Both traded across enormous distances, and both knew, in some form, that the other existed. And they did all of this in two completely different environments, with two completely different materials, in two completely different political structures, producing two genuinely different civilizations. Mesopotamia, competitive and innovative and politically fragmented, always rebuilding in mud, because the mud dissolved and the floods came, and the city-states next door were always watching. Egypt, stable and long-lasting and administratively cohesive, building in stone because the desert preserved what it touched, and the Nile made it possible to feed and manage an entire elongated country from a single point. They were not versions of each other, They were two different experiments in what a civilization could be, what it could look like, what it could prioritize, what it could build and sustain. And there is real evidence, in the knife handle and the cylinder seals and the trade goods, that these two experiments were aware of each other while they were running, that the awareness of the other's existence may have accelerated each one's development, that the two rivers, separated by 1,500 kilometers of desert and sea, were in a conversation across the gap. The question, who was first, is a modern habit, the ranking habit, the desire for a single winner, the urge to collapse a complex thing into a simple verdict. The evidence shows something richer. It shows a conversation. Two peoples at the threshold of something genuinely new. The recording of the past, the management of complexity at scale, the organization of thousands of human beings towards shared goals, each finding their own way across, each probably knowing, at some level and at some remove, that the crossing was possible because someone else was attempting it. Everything you have ever read began, twice, in the same 100 years. That is the answer, and behind it, 6,000 years earlier, in the limestone hills of southeastern Turkey, there is a third beginning by people who left no name, who built without cities or writing or metal, and whose reasons for building remain, and will likely remain, in the dark of the buried enclosures they filled and walked away from. The question of who came first has not one answer but several, and each answer depends on what you mean by civilization, what measure you apply, what evidence you prioritize, what aspect of human society you decide is most fundamental. Cities, Uruk, countries, Egypt, writing, a tie, or perhaps Uruk by a margin our methods cannot confirm. Monuments, neither. Continuous tradition, Egypt, mathematical legacy surviving into the present, Sumer. But there is a version of the question that is more interesting than any of these, and it is the version that the evidence keeps pushing us toward. Not who came first. But what were they doing? Not who arrived earliest at a fixed finish line, but what kind of project each civilization was pursuing, what it was trying to build, what it believed the world needed, what it thought human beings were for. Mesopotamia was trying to manage complexity, the canal networks, the administrative tablets, the scribal training schools, the standardized rations and beveled rim bowls. All of this is infrastructure for managing more people, more transactions, more decisions than the unaided human mind can handle. The Mesopotamian civilizational project was logistical. How do we feed, organize, and track the activities of tens of thousands of people in one place? The answer was, write it down, count it, store it, review it, update it next season. The administrative tablet is the engine of the Mesopotamian city, as essential to the functioning of Uruk as the irrigation canals themselves. Egypt was trying to achieve permanence. The stone buildings, the mummified dead, the 3,000-year continuity of the pharaonic tradition, the obsessive inscription of every available surface with the names and deeds and prayers of the powerful. All of this is an attempt to defeat time, to make the present moment survive into a future that cannot be anticipated. The hieroglyphic inscription on the tomb wall is not just an administrative record or a theological statement. It is a bid for survival. If the inscription exists, the person exists, because the name is the person in the Egyptian conception, and a name inscribed in stone is a name that the decay of the body cannot erase. The Egyptian civilizational project was existential. How do we make this last? These are not the same project, and both of them are still running. Every institution that manages complexity for large numbers of people, every government, every corporation, every hospital, every university, every logistics system and supply chain and database is running the Mesopotamian project. The insight that external storage of information is necessary for managing collective human action at scale is the foundation of every institution that has ever existed. And every monument, every museum, every archive, every act of deliberate preservation, every decision to write something down not because it is immediately useful, but because it should be remembered, is running the Egyptian project. The insight that the present moment will become the past, and that something should survive it, is the foundation of every library and every cemetery and every cultural tradition that has ever tried to hold on. Both projects began in the same century and a half. Both are still here. And underneath all of these, a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey where someone gathered 11,600 years ago and built something they cared enough about to bury when the time came. Here is what I want to leave you with, before the voice goes quiet and the night takes the rest of the evening. The administrators in the Eanna district of Uruk, the people who pressed reeds into wet clay in the lamplight of the temple offices, recording grain and livestock and beer rations, were not thinking about posterity. They were not reaching for the ages. They were not aware that what they were doing would matter to anyone 5,000 years later, or 5 years later, or 5 months later. They were solving an immediate and practical problem. There was too much to remember, and their memory was failing, and the solution was to make the memory external. Put it somewhere that isn't the inside of someone's head. Put it in clay, and the person in the pre-dynastic royal workshop at Abydos, carving tiny signs into a thumbnail of bone with a flint tool, making a label for a jar of wine that had come from the Levantine coast, was not reaching for eternity either. They were reaching for clarity. For the person at the other end of the journey who needed to know what was in the jar. For the administrator who had to tally what had arrived. Neither of them was doing anything grand. Both of them were doing something necessary. And yet, because they did the necessary thing and made a mark, we know they existed. We know what the sky goddess of Uruk was called. We know approximately how much beer a labourer was entitled to per day. We know that a pre-dynastic king of Upper Egypt received wine from Lebanon and obsidian from a mountain several hundred miles away, and had someone in his court who could read a label tied to a jar. We know that an ivory carver in Upper Egypt around 3200 BC had seen or heard about a Mesopotamian artistic motif and incorporated it into an object made for an Egyptian patron who found it desirable. We know all of this because marks on surfaces hold. The marks held through 5,000 years of sand and darkness, and accidental discovery and careful excavation. They held through the plundering of tombs and the collapse of cities and the rise and fall of everything that came after. They held through Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome and the Dark Ages and the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution and 2 world wars. They are still here. Now the mirror turns. You have done this. Not in clay, not in bone, not with a flint tool or a cut reed, but functionally, in the deepest sense of what the action means. You have done exactly this. A note in your phone, a reminder set for tomorrow morning, a list on the back of an envelope, a message sent to a friend so that something you both needed to remember had somewhere to live, other than one of your heads, a word written on your hand in ink, because you knew from experience that the thought wouldn't survive until you got home otherwise. You have made marks to help yourself remember. You have extended your cognition beyond your skull and into the world, into screens, into paper, into whatever surface was available, for exactly the same reason that the administrator in Uruk made marks, because there was too much to carry, because the memory needed help, because the information mattered and you wanted it to persist beyond the moment. The form is different, the function is identical. And here is what I want you to notice about that continuity, because it is easy to acknowledge and easy to dismiss, and worth sitting with more carefully than either. When you make a mark to help yourself remember, a note on the back of your hand, a reminder in your phone, a message to yourself sent for tomorrow morning, you are not performing a modern action that happened by coincidence to resemble something ancient. You are performing the ancient action, the cognitive operation, externalizing memory, encoding information in a form that persists outside the mind, trusting that a future version of yourself or another person will be able to decode it, is structurally identical to what the administrator in Uruk's temple district was doing with a cut reed and wet clay. The substrate has changed, the action has not. This matters because it is easy to imagine the people of the distant past as fundamentally different from us, as simpler or stranger or less fully formed. The clay tablets and the bone tags can feel like artifacts of another species, small, brown, cryptic, housed behind glass, in institutions specifically designed to mark the distance between the people who made them and the people who look at them. But the action those objects record is not different from your action. The problem those objects were solving is not different from your problem. The cognitive operation that produced them is not different from your cognitive operation. What is different is everything outside the mind: the language, the material, the specific signs, the political and religious context in which the act of record-keeping was embedded. The inside, the decision to make a mark that will hold information for later, is the same. The gap between you and them, 5,300 years of it, is, in terms of what the act means and what problem it solves, nothing at all. You are continuous with them, not metaphorically, not as poetic license, but materially, through a documented and traceable chain of transmission. The writing you use descends from the Phoenician alphabet, which descends from the Proto-Sinitic script, which itself shows clear influence from Egyptian hieroglyphic forms. The hieroglyphic tradition began, at the edge of the evidence, in the window we've been circling all night, in a royal workshop in the desert at Abydos. The numerals you use for counting entered European mathematics from Arabic scholarship, which preserved and transmitted Greek and Babylonian mathematical traditions. The clock you check descended from the Sumerian sexagesimal system. The 365-day year you navigate by descended from the Egyptian observation of the Nile and Sirius. These things are not past, they are present. They are the structure inside which you live your life without noticing it, the way you don't notice the architecture of the building you're sitting in until someone points out which century it was built in. The thread from the cut reed in Uruk to the mark you make tonight has never broken. It has changed form many times. It has passed through many hands and many languages and many systems, but it has never broken. 5,300 years of trusting that marks on surfaces hold, and they held, and they are holding still.